cetera, et cetera. And that's not true at all. I mean, competencies are domains, areas in which you have to demonstrate functionality, and you're deemed then competent if you can minimally perform at some level. Milestones are really about tracking development over time of an individual. And so if you think about the growth of a learner, everybody basically starts at sort of a zero level, and then over time you develop increasing expertise, and hopefully eventually you're not just competent, but you may grow to be an expert or a master in this. And so in graduate medical education, each specialty area was asked to develop, and committees got together in every different specialty area, variety of experts, including educational experts, PhD, psychologists, lots of different communication specialists, etc. And for each specialty area and in each of the competency domains, they defined some specific skill sets, knowledge, skills, attitudes, performance, in which they expect to see evolution and growth over time. And so they defined a series, and in most cases it's a series of 5 that are defined milestones when you can accomplish this by yourself. And maybe you can take the history and physical, but you don't know what to do with it. So just being able to complete the history and physical is milestone 1. Being able to establish the differential diagnosis that's appropriate may be milestone 2. Being able to place consults appropriately and order diagnostic and therapeutic intervention to explore your differential may be milestone 3. But so for each domain of competency, there may be 5 to 10. It's different in each specialty area, but these are benchmarks across time. In most specialty areas, they've also defined that the average first-year resident would be at milestone 1 or 2. The average second-year resident might be at milestone 2 to 3. You may not be at the milestone. You may be somewhere in between. You may do it sometimes, but not consistently. A finishing or graduating resident may be in some programs at milestone 3 to 4, and after practicing for 10 or 15 years, you might hit milestone 5. So these are not that you've got to get through all of these milestones before you graduate the program. They're really looking at skills development over a career, essentially. As part of this next accreditation system, every program has been required to define a clinical competency committee, which will look at all the input from all areas. So the evaluations that residents do of each other, that patients do of residents, that faculty do of residents, their journal club review, their performance on their in-training examinations, their reports, eye care reports through the nursing system, whatever. That committee is charged with looking at all the available information on any given resident and determining for all of the milestones defined in that specialty area where each individual resident now is. It's really been a good thing in that it's helping us to begin to identify people early that are falling a little behind, and we're already beginning to see that we're having much earlier intervention. Used to be that we'd have somebody starting residency and they would have their semi-annual evaluation starting in July, they'd semi-annual evaluation in January, and we'd say, oh, well, it just took them a little bit of time getting here, and we'd say, oh, you need to get better at this, and then in June they're not ready to promote, and it's just kind of waffled along here, and we've not had good hard things to say. Well, look, everybody else in your class at your level can do this and do it every single time right, and you don't. So it's giving us more objective information. It's really allowing us to identify both sort of the fallouts below and the fallouts above. So we do have trainees that are better. This is engendering more discussion at a national level about, does every trainee need the same amount of time? So to be a general surgeon, you have to do 5 years of general surgery. Well, it may be that some people could actually be great general surgeons in 4 years, and some others might need 6 years. So there is a lot of discussion about whether or not, as we really gain expertise with using the milestones, whether or not at some point in the future we may want to provide a little bit more flexibility in how training happens. I think we're a long way away from that, but it's a possibility. Eventually, I believe that milestones will be put. We are reporting this to the ACGME too. Historically, individual resident performance was only reported to the boards because they had the responsibility for approving individual trainee performance. I think the intent of the ACGME is to then to be able to say, okay, we've got all this milestone data, let's look at PGY2s as a group. Nationally, this is where PGY2s are OOP. This program's PGY2s are performing at a lower level in the milestones. So it would also be a way to potentially look at your curriculum and your program and whether or not it's accomplishing things at the same speed, perhaps, as other programs with similar learners are accomplishing that. So I believe that's going to be very helpful in the future. Right now, we don't have that information available. So does that kind of give you some competency?
And just having an education background, what a wonderful,
it's a great tool.
Wonderful tool, a great idea and wonderful tool.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, so the last thing that I wanted us to talk about are duty hours. And in our first segment, you made reference to duty hours, and you made reference to someone perhaps being as a site visitor or here and having the opportunity to ask a nurse, how do you recognize when a resident is fatigued? So I'd like for you just to broadly talk about duty hours in terms of when things changed as far as the guidelines and kind of the implications of that for a residency program and also for a hospital to operate.
Okay. So, for years, graduate medical education programs have and their hospitals in which they are located have relied very heavily on residents for service. Of course, that's how you learn. I mean, residents are cheap labor, but you also learn by doing things over and over again. And quite frankly, as a resident who went through the system where I often worked 120-hour weeks, where I once went 87 days without a day I did not come into the hospital. Yeah, I mean, that was pretty much the norm. My experience was not unusual. It was very typical for that time period. And I never really thought a lot about it because I thought that when I signed on to be a doctor, it meant that I signed on to whatever self-sacrifice was required. Although in the late 90s, mid-90s into late 90s, there were a number of things that happened nationally in which residents who had been on call for long shifts made decisions that resulted in patient harm that then brought a focus on how, we won't let a pilot fly a plane for 40 hours straight. Why are we letting a doctor work for 40 hours straight taking care of critically ill patients? And do we not think there are mistakes that happen simply because doctors are so tired? And doctors that are training, who are not experts yet, are even more likely to make these mistakes. So there were, again, a number of committees convened. It's that theme there. There's always a committee that convenes.
At a national level.
At a national level. So committees are convened at a national level, in part because of a huge push by New York State, where they had actually a very well-known, prestigious person had a daughter that died in a university hospital in New York that was related to an airman by a fatigued resident. And so it looked as though the federal government might actually step in to regulate nationally hours that resident trainees could work. And so in part driven by that, the graduate medical education community said, we want to police ourselves here, let us look and define what's reasonable. And so in 2003, duty hours mandates were placed into all of those requirements as part of the common program requirements. It went into all of the requirements for every single specialty. And to start with, they defined that on average over 4 weeks, every resident had to have 1 day free of duty. Didn't mean you had to have one day off every 7, but it meant that on any month rotation, you needed to have at least 4 days off. It oftentimes would be 2 weekends, so you might work every other weekend or something like that. So 1 day in 7 free of duty. You could not, on average, across the course of a single month, work more than 80 hours a week. And they specifically define these as over a month because there are rotations that are very heavy, and then there are rotations that are lighter, and they didn't want us to have residents killing themselves for 3 months and then having a light month and then killing themselves again. So it's over a 1 month period. Can't work more than 80 hours on average a week. Must have 1 day off in 7 free of duties. Cannot work longer than a 24-hour shift plus 4, initially it was plus 6 additional hours. So you could not be in a hospital for more than 30 hours straight. And there was a lot of confusion to start with. Is this just about patient care? Does this also mean your conferences and your research presentations and all the different pieces of residency education? And it actually is everything. So when you've got to be out of the hospital, not carrying a pager, completely off duty, et cetera, et cetera. There were some things about picking up new patients after you've been on a 24-hour call and some other pieces like that. But those are really the big pieces: the length of a shift, 1 day off in 7, and no more than 80 hours a week. And the hardest hit by that were actually most of the surgical subspecialties, where it was not uncommon at all for residents to work 120 hours a week and that sort of thing. And so it has had a huge impact on hospitals nationally, and mostly because hospitals had to add a lot of additional personnel, mostly mid-level providers, nurse practitioners, PAs, in some cases RNs, and in some cases administrative people to do things that residents historically did: track down results, call outside people, write discharge notes, a lot of things, a lot of paperwork pieces and stuff like that residents did. It really forced programs to look very hard at their curricula and what were the key learning pieces and how do residents get that content. I think simulation has expanded dramatically because literally for a neurosurgery program where people always worked 120 hours a week and they now work 80 hours a week, you've reduced by 30% the amount of time they're going to spend in training. And a lot of that time was operating room time for those guys. And so we've had to figure out other ways to try and give them equivalent experience. And so simulation has become a huge big deal. More and more online module. A lot of programs move didactics to they don't have standard lectures for an hour a day anymore. Instead, they have a conference day on a Saturday once a month, or it's all online modules, and they've purchased online curricula, and you do it on your own and complete an exam and do it sometime over the course of the year in whatever your lighter months are when you have time. There are some estimates that I wish I could quote them to you, but I can't. There are some estimates about what the cost to healthcare in America has been based simply on the impact of duty hours, and it's big. It's like over, I want to say it's like hundreds of millions of dollars.
That sounds like a good assignment for the students.
Figure out how much this has cost. But there are a number of papers out there. And obviously it's had different impacts on different places. Here, we immediately had a lot of changes in call schedules. We had consolidations of services. We had the development of non-teaching services. So prior to 2003, there was not a patient that came into University Hospital that we did not have physicians in training involved with. And now we do have completely isolated services that have no residents on them, that are being taken care of by healthcare providers, faculty, physician, nurse practitioners without any learner involvement. And again, it simply has to do with those hours restrictions, and there's some patient load restrictions that came along with that as well. So big impacts on hospitals in terms of the manpower needed to pick up the slack when the residents were no longer available for the length of time, stretches of time, etc., that they had historically been.
Thank you very much.
Is that
That's just what
kinda-
we needed to know.
Kind of.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to have helped. Thank you.